My name is Jeremiah Knox, and I never thought I'd have to defend my property from my ex-wife's new husband. But ever since she married Troy Maddox, something changed. He didn't just replace me in her life. He declared war on mine. I didn't see it coming. We lived on the same street for years, a quiet neighborhood with families who waved from their porches and kids who left their bicycles in the driveways. I thought it would stay that way even after the divorce. I thought it would be awkward at worst. But the day Maribel brought Troy home, he marked his territory like a dog on a fire hydrant. It started small. A scratch here, a dent there. I shrugged it off at first. Life's full of little accidents, I told myself. Maybe the neighborhood kids were getting careless. Maybe it was nothing. But then it happened again. A new scratch on my car door, perfectly straight, as if it had been done with a key. The metal flaked, the paint peeled like dead skin. And that night, when I came home from work, Troy was sitting in his driveway across the street, beer in hand, just staring at me. He smirked. That kind of smirk that says, I own this now. I looked away, pretending not to notice, but the unease in my gut wouldn't leave. The next morning, I found a nail in my front tire. At first, I thought maybe I'd run over it somewhere, but when I pulled it out, I noticed how clean it was. No dirt, no rust. Like it had been placed there, deliberately. I changed the tire, cursing under my breath, and glanced across the street. There he was again, leaning against his truck, arms folded, eyes hidden behind those cheap mirrored sunglasses. He lifted his chin just a fraction, a silent challenge. I turned back to my driveway and forced myself to breathe. No confrontation. Not yet. But it didn't stop. A week later, another nail. Then a small crack on the windshield, like someone had thrown a rock from a distance. I checked my security camera, but it was an old model, blurry at best. Nothing useful. I called the police, but they couldn't do much without evidence. Probably some kids, the officer said with a sympathetic shrug. Keep an eye out. I nodded, thanked him, but inside, I knew exactly who it was. And he knew I knew. One evening, as the sun dipped below the rooftops, I was out in the yard watering the grass. Troy came out, shirtless, beer in hand, his tattoos catching the fading light. He leaned against his fence, watching me. I ignored him, focusing on the hose, the water arcing over the lawn. But he wouldn't look away. Finally, he spoke. Nice car, he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. I didn't respond. He took a swig of his beer and laughed. Hope you got good insurance. That night, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, my hands clenched. I tried to think of the old days when Maribel and I were happy, when we used to host barbecues for the neighbors, when laughter came easy. But those memories felt like they belonged to someone else. Now, it was me against him. Me against the man who'd taken my place. I couldn't let him win. Not like this. The next morning, I checked my car before heading to work. I circled it twice, inspecting every inch. No scratches. No nails. But the air felt charged, like a storm waiting to break. I drove to work with one eye on the rearview mirror. Every time I thought about Troy's smirk, my hands tightened on the wheel. At the office, I tried to focus, but my mind kept drifting back to him. His grin. His mirrored sunglasses. The way he always seemed to know when I was looking. When I got home that evening, I parked and took a deep breath before getting out of the car. I scanned the driveway, the yard, the mailbox. Everything seemed normal, but that only made my skin crawl. I didn't see him at first. But then, from the corner of my eye, I spotted movement. Troy was in his garage, leaning against the doorframe, a beer bottle dangling from his fingers. He raised it in a silent toast, his smirk even wider this time. I clenched my jaw, forcing myself to stay calm. I wouldn't give him the satisfaction of losing my temper. Not yet. I turned and walked to my front door, keys trembling in my hand. That night, I sat at my kitchen table, staring at the wooden grain, the memories of family dinners and birthday cakes. I wondered if Maribel had ever loved me or if she'd been waiting for someone like him all along. Someone who could stand on a driveway, beer in hand, and smirk like he owned the world. Sleep didn't come easy. Every creak of the house made me tense. Every gust of wind felt like a threat. Around midnight, I heard a sound faint, but there. I got up, peered through the blinds. Nothing. Just the quiet street, the shadows of mailboxes and fences. But I felt him, like a wolf waiting in the dark. I thought about calling the police again, but what would I say? That I was being watched? That my ex-wife's new husband was harassing me with smirks and scratches? They'd laugh me out of the station. So I made a decision. If he wanted to play games, I'd play smarter. I'd watch. I'd wait. And when the time was right, I'd make my move. I wouldn't be the victim anymore. I'd be the one who saw it coming, the one who refused to break. Because this wasn't just about property or pride. It was about proving to myself that I wouldn't let him, or anyone, bully me out of my own life. I closed the blinds and sat back down at the table, the shadows long and familiar. My name is Jeremiah Knox. And tomorrow, the game would begin. I tried to be civil. It was the only way I knew how to handle the mess I'd found myself in. After all, I wasn't the type to throw punches at the drop of a hat. My dad taught me better than that. But after weeks of silent aggression, every day felt like a test of how much I could tolerate. And today, I was done tolerating. The air felt thick as I walked across the street, my feet crunching on the pavement. Maribel was in the front yard, tending to the flower bed she'd started when we were still together. She had that satisfied look on her face, like she'd finally arranged her life exactly the way she wanted. I stopped a few feet away, waiting for her to notice me. She didn't look up right away, her hands buried in the dirt. I cleared my throat. Maribel, can we talk? She finally glanced at me, her eyes hidden behind oversized sunglasses. Her lips curled into a small, cold smile. What do you want, Jeremiah? She sounded tired, or maybe annoyed. It was hard to tell these days. I shifted my weight, feeling a bead of sweat slide down my neck. It's about Troy. The name tasted like bitterness in my mouth. She laughed, a short, dismissive sound that sliced right through me. Of course it's about Troy. She stood up, brushing dirt from her hands. Men will be men, she said with a mocking tone. Troy's a real man. Not like you. Her words hit me harder than I expected. I felt my jaw clench, my chest tightening with that familiar ache. I wanted to yell, to call her out for every lie she'd let him tell. But I didn't. I held it in. Because yelling wouldn't solve anything. Instead, I stared at her, my heart beating so hard I thought she might hear it. Just talk to him, I managed to say. Tell him to stop. Stop what? She asked, her tone dripping with indifference. Stop being himself? I shook my head, biting down on my frustration. Stop vandalizing my car. Stop threatening me. Stop acting like he owns this neighborhood. She arched an eyebrow. Prove it, she challenged. I almost laughed at that. Prove it? Like I hadn't been living in a constant state of watchfulness, documenting every scratch, every nail, every shadow of him smirking from across the street. I'd started keeping a log, times, dates, photos. I'd even installed a small camera on my front porch, hidden behind the lantern. I'm working on that, I said quietly. Don't play dumb, Maribel. You know what he's been doing. She sighed dramatically and turned back to her flowers. Jeremiah, you're being paranoid. Troy's not like that. He's a good man. Maybe if you acted like one, he'd leave you alone. I opened my mouth to respond but stopped myself. What was the point? Every word out of her mouth felt rehearsed, like she'd been practicing it with him in the dark of their living room, both of them feeding off the idea that I was the enemy. So I turned away, feeling the sting of her words deep in my bones. As I walked back to my house, I felt something shift inside me. It was like a quiet switch flipping it. Like I'd decided that if no one else was going to stand up for me, then I'd do it myself. I wasn't going to let Troy walk all over me just because he'd wormed his way into Maribel's life. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with the logbook open in front of me. I flipped through the pages, each entry a reminder of the steady escalation. March 15th, small scratch on driver's side door. March 20th, nail in rear tire. March 25th, crack in windshield, likely from a rock. April 2nd, Troy smirking at me from his driveway, beer in hand. April 10th, another nail, this time in the front left tire. April 18th, found an unfamiliar footprint in my garden. I took a deep breath, letting the anger settle into something sharp and focused. If they wanted proof, I'd get proof. I'd make it impossible for them to deny. I reached for my laptop and started researching security cameras, motion sensors, and trip alarms. I wasn't going to fight like a brute. I was going to fight smart. I set up a folder on my computer labeled Troy Maddox Evidence. I uploaded every photo I'd taken, every time-stamped entry. I cross-referenced everything with the local police reports, even though most of them ended with a polite, insufficient evidence stamp. I knew that wouldn't be the case for long. If Troy wanted to play this game, I'd play it better. I ordered a wildlife camera with night vision, the kind hunters used to track deer in the woods. I ordered motion detectors, small ones I could hide in my flower beds. I even ordered a can of industrial paint that would mark anyone who tripped a line, leaving them with a bright stain that wouldn't wash off easily. As I hit place order, I felt a small smile creep across my face. It wasn't satisfaction or revenge, it was resolve. I wasn't going to let him push me out of my own life. This was my house, my street, my peace, and I'd protect it, even if no one else would. I leaned back in my chair, exhaling a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. The kitchen clock ticked softly in the silence, each second a promise that things were about to change. I wasn't the kind of man who swung fists or screamed threats. I was the kind of man who planned, who documented, who made sure that when the hammer fell, it fell hard and inescapable. That night, as I got ready for bed, I felt a strange kind of calm. Not because I thought it would be easy, but because I knew I was finally taking control. The logs, the photos, the cameras, these were my weapons. And Troy Maddox had no idea what was coming. One morning, I stepped out and froze. All 4 tires of my car were slashed beyond repair. Jagged gashes in the rubber, like someone had taken a box cutter to them with the kind of rage you only see in nightmares. My breath caught in my throat, a sharp, icy panic creeping up my spine. I stared at the mess, at the way the tires sagged like deflated lungs, the asphalt beneath them dark with the slow leak of everything I'd worked for. This wasn't just a prank. This was a declaration of war. But that wasn't even the worst part. My garden, my sanctuary, was destroyed. Soil upturned, my rose bushes yanked from the roots and left to wither in the sun like dying soldiers. The lattice arbor I'd built with my own hands, the one Maribel used to sit under with a glass of wine, and that soft smile she saved just for me, it was splintered, its beams cracked and broken. The roses I'd trained to climb it left dangling like broken fingers. I felt like I'd been gutted, every hope and memory torn apart by someone who wanted to watch me bleed. I sank to my knees in the dirt, my hands trembling as I tried to right one of the bushes. The roots had been shredded. The leaves were brown at the edges, as if even they knew this was the end. A gust of wind carried the smell of cut grass from the neighbor's yard, a scent that should have calmed me but instead made the bile rise in my throat. Because it reminded me of home, and this didn't feel like home anymore. It felt like a battlefield. My throat burned with a scream I didn't let out. I forced myself to stand, to look at the wreckage with clear eyes. That was when I saw him. Troy, standing at the edge of his driveway, arms folded across his chest, a smirk on his lips that made me want to break every bone in his face. He didn't say a word, just tilted his head like he was inspecting his handiwork. The rage boiled up so fast it nearly choked me. My fingers curled into fists at my sides, nails biting into my palms. I imagined lunging across the street, imagined the satisfying crunch of his nose beneath my knuckles. But I didn't move. Not yet. Because this wasn't a fight I was going to win with fists. This was a fight for everything I had left, my dignity, my name, my home. I turned my back on him and walked slowly into the house, each step deliberate, like I was reminding myself I still had control. I closed the door behind me, leaned against it, and let the tears come. Just for a moment. Just enough to feel the weight of it all. Then I wiped my face and straightened up. I wasn't broken. Not yet. I poured myself a cup of coffee, the bitter liquid steadying my hands. As I drank, I replayed every moment from the last few months, the scratches on my car, the nails in my tires, the smirk that never left his face. Every little humiliation added up to this, to the wreckage outside. I could almost hear his voice in my head, laughing at me. "What are you going to do about it, Jeremiah?" I finished my coffee and set the cup down with a quiet clink. My hands stopped trembling. My mind cleared. I whispered to myself, "Okay, now we do it my way." I grabbed my notebook and flipped to the page marked Troy. Every entry, every date, every photo, all carefully cataloged. I read through them like a soldier reading an enemy dossier. And then I turned to a clean page and wrote, "Next step." I listed what I'd need. More cameras, hidden better this time. Motion sensors. Tripwires. A friend with security experience. I wasn't going to fight him with my fists. I was going to outthink him. I pulled out my phone and scrolled through my contacts until I found Omar's name. He'd served 2 tours overseas and came back with enough know-how to secure a small country, let alone a suburban garden. I hit call. He answered on the second ring. "Jeremiah? Long time, brother. How's it going?" His voice was warm, calm, exactly what I needed. I swallowed the lump in my throat. "Hey, Omar. You busy? For you?" "Never. What's up?" I took a deep breath. "I need your help. Someone's messing with me. I need to catch them in the act." There was a pause, then a low whistle. "Say no more. I'll be there tonight." Relief washed over me like a cool rain. "Thanks, man." After we hung up, I went outside and surveyed the wreckage again. The tires would have to wait. I'd call a tow truck later. The garden hurt the most. Every plant I'd nurtured from seed, every bloom that had brought me peace, lay in ruins. But even that wasn't enough to make me give up. I walked back inside and rummaged through the hall closet, pulling out the old toolbox my dad had given me when I first bought this house. It was dented and worn, but it felt like a piece of him in my hands. He'd always told me, if someone takes something from you, you don't let it break you. You build it back, stronger. I ran my fingers over the battered metal, feeling the weight of his words. I was going to build it back. When Omar arrived that evening, he took one look at the damage and let out a low whistle. Jesus, man, this guy's a real piece of work. I nodded, my jaw tight. I need to catch him, Omar. I need proof. I want to do this right. He clapped a hand on my shoulder. We'll get him. He pulled a small duffel bag from his car, filled with gear that looked like it belonged in a war zone. We'll start with a couple motion sensors, put them under the mulch so they're hidden. Then a wildlife cam. Those things are small, infrared, totally silent. We'll catch him in the act, no question. I exhaled a breath I didn't know I'd been holding. Thank you. We worked well into the night, setting up the sensors and calibrating the camera to pick up even the slightest movement. Every time we placed a sensor, I felt a small spark of hope flicker in my chest. Like maybe, just maybe, I could win this. When we were done, Omar wiped his hands on his jeans and grinned. There. Now all we have to do is wait. I looked at the darkened street, at Troy's house, at the smirk I could practically feel in the air. I've been waiting a long time, I said quietly. Omar slapped my back. Then it's time for him to wait for you. I nodded, my resolve hardening like concrete. This wasn't just about revenge. It was about taking my life back, inch by inch, root by root. The garden could be replanted. The tires could be replaced. But my spirit? That was mine to defend. And I'd fight smart. I'd fight like the man my father taught me to be. Because Troy Maddox had declared war on my life. And now it was my turn to show him what real strength looked like. I didn't go to the police. Not yet. I learned that the slow grind of bureaucracy would only give Troy more time to make me look paranoid. So instead, I went to the hardware store. The smell of sawdust and oil hit me as soon as I walked through the sliding glass doors, the familiar creak of the linoleum under my boots bringing back memories of better days, days when a simple Saturday trip meant picking up mulch or paint, not buying tools to defend myself. I moved down the aisles with a quiet focus, my mind ticking like a metronome. Motion sensors, tripwire alarms, a wildlife camera. I picked them up one by one, adding them to my cart like pieces of armor. Each item felt like a step toward taking back control. As I checked out, the teenage cashier gave me a nervous smile, her eyes flicking from my grim face to the mound of gear. Big project? She asked, trying for a casual tone. I forced a smile. Something like that, I said, my voice low. She scanned the last box and gave me the total. As I handed over my card, I couldn't help but glance over my shoulder, half expecting to see Troy lurking in the shadows. But it was just the usual Saturday crowd. Families with kids, an older man looking at paint samples, a young couple arguing over faucet fixtures. Normal people living normal lives. I envied them. I carried the bags out to my truck and set them gently in the bed. The sun was starting to dip, painting the sky with streaks of gold and orange. I climbed in, started the engine, and let it idle for a moment, my hands gripping the wheel. My eyes fell on the garden across the street. My garden, the one that had been destroyed. A tightness gripped my chest, a reminder that every petal, every leaf, had been a testament to the life I'd built. And now it was gone. But that was going to change. I wasn't going to let him win. I pulled into my driveway, the tires crunching over the gravel. Omar's old pickup was already parked out front. He stood by the porch, arms folded, a quiet confidence radiating off him like heat. You ready for this? He asked as I climbed out. I nodded, and he gave me a grin. Let's make this bastard wish he'd never heard your name. He climbed into his car and drove off, leaving a sense of finality in his wake. I stood there for a moment, watching the cruiser disappear around the corner, the sound of its engine fading like the last note of a long, bitter song. The street was quiet again, the birds singing as if they'd never stopped. I looked at my house, my home, and felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Peace. Inside, I washed my hands at the kitchen sink, the water turning the dirt on my skin into swirling rivers that disappeared down the drain. I looked up at the window, at the yard where the roses once bloomed, and felt a strange sense of hope. I'd survived the worst of it. I'd faced down the man who'd tried to take my life apart, and I'd won. Not with fists, but with patience and proof. I'd shown him that some men can't be broken. I dried my hands and poured myself a cup of coffee, the warmth seeping into my bones like a quiet reward. I sipped it slowly, savoring the taste of something earned, not given. Outside, the wind carried the scent of cut grass and the promise of new beginnings. I glanced at the empty space where my rose arbor used to stand, already picturing the new one I'd build stronger, more beautiful, unbreakable. As I sat there, a small smile spread across my face. Not because I wanted revenge, but because I'd taken back my power. And that, I decided, was enough for me. With the peace restored, I rebuilt my garden. It wasn't about flowers anymore, not just about them, anyway. It was about reclaiming the piece of myself that had been trampled under Troy's boots and Maribel's indifference. Every shovel of soil, every planted seed, every stake driven into the ground felt like a quiet rebellion against the chaos that had tried to define my life. I started with the rose arbor. I'd built the first one by hand years ago, using scraps of pine from the hardware store and a YouTube tutorial that promised easy elegance. But that one had been torn apart in minutes. This time, I chose steel, galvanized, thick, the kind that would stand through wind, rain, or the next petty war a man like Troy might bring. The local metal artist, Eloise, had been recommended by a neighbor who'd seen her work at the community center, artistic but sturdy. She met me at the garden, a tall woman with a mane of curly hair and hands that looked like they'd wrestled dragons. "You want a rose arbor that can survive a hurricane," she said, her eyes dancing. I nodded, feeling the tension in my chest ease a little. "Something like that," I replied. She walked the perimeter of the old garden, studying the space like an architect. "We can do better than survive," she said. "We'll make it beautiful and strong." For the first time in a long while, I let myself believe it. Over the next few weeks, Eloise and I worked together. She'd come by on Saturdays with her sketchbook and her welding equipment, while I cleared out the broken remnants of the past. Together, we laid the foundation, steel beams that would hold not just roses, but my resolve. As we worked, we talked. About gardens, about life, about how sometimes the strongest things grow from the ruins. She told me about the orchids she grew in her greenhouse, delicate but stubborn, refusing to die even when everything else had given up. I told her about the way the garden had felt before it all went to hell, how Maribel had loved the climbing roses, the smell of lavender on summer nights. I admitted, quietly, that I didn't know if I'd ever let myself trust anyone like that again. She didn't flinch. She just nodded, welding torch in hand. "That's okay," she said, sparks dancing in her hair like fireflies. "Sometimes the only thing you need to trust is that you're stronger than the last thing that tried to break you." Her words settled into the soil of my chest, and for the first time in a long time, I felt roots there again. We worked side by side, her laughter warm and easy. It reminded me that the world wasn't made of just betrayal and bruises, that there was light too, if you were willing to open the blinds. I found myself smiling more often, even as sweat dripped from my brow and dirt caked my nails. The neighbors watched from a distance at first, curious but cautious. Then one by one, they began to stop by, some with cups of lemonade, others with a simple nod or a "good work, Jeremiah." Little things, but they meant more than I could say. One evening, as the sun dipped low and cast a golden glow across the steel frame of the arbor, Eloise leaned back on her heels and whistled. "Look at that," she said, admiration in her voice. "Solid, beautiful, just like you, Jeremiah." I felt my cheeks warm, and I ducked my head. "Thanks," I mumbled. She nudged my arm with her elbow. "No, really," she said. "This isn't just about metal and roses. This is about you taking your life back. Don't let anyone tell you different." I looked at her, her eyes bright with sincerity, and felt a warmth in my chest that had nothing to do with the summer heat. Maybe she was right. Maybe I had finally taken something back. The next morning, I woke up early, the dew still fresh on the grass. I pulled on my old work boots, the ones with the scuffed toes from all those years of shoveling and hammering, and walked outside. The new arbor stood tall and proud, its steel glinting in the dawnlight. I ran my hand along the smooth curve of the arch, feeling the strength in its bones. It felt like a promise that no one, not Troy, not Maribel, could tear down again. I opened the box of rose seedlings I'd ordered weeks before, each tiny plant a fragile hope waiting for its chance to bloom. I knelt in the dirt and began planting, my hands steady. As I worked, I thought about all the nights I'd spent awake, listening for the sound of footsteps in the dark. I thought about the rage, the helplessness, the way Troy's smirk had made my stomach twist. And I thought about how, in the end, I hadn't needed to fight him with fists. I'd fought him with patience, with proof, with the quiet strength that my father had taught me. Eloise showed up just as I was patting down the last seedling. She carried a small box, carefully cradled in her hands. "A gift," she said, her grin wide. She opened it to reveal a tiny orchid plant, its petals a delicate pink, its leaves thick and glossy. "For your new start," she said. "It's tougher than it looks." I took it from her, feeling the weight of her trust in my hands. "Thank you," I said, my voice thick. She leaned in and kissed my cheek, the gesture as soft as the orchid's petals. "You're welcome," she whispered. We planted the orchid together, right at the base of the arbor. As the last handful of soil settled around its roots, I felt a sense of completion, like a circle closing. This was my garden now. Rebuilt, stronger, a testament to every broken thing I'd refused to let define me. The roses would climb the steel, their thorns and blooms a promise that beauty and pain can coexist, that sometimes you have to bleed a little to grow. I stood and wiped the sweat from my brow, my heart steady. Eloise stood beside me, her hands on her hips, her eyes shining with pride. "You've done good, Jeremiah," she said. "Real good." I nodded, feeling the truth of it deep in my bones. The garden might not erase everything that had happened, but it was a start. A place to put down new roots. A place to remind myself that I was still standing, still growing, no matter what storms had come my way. As the sun set and the shadows grew long, I sat on the porch with a glass of iced tea, watching the breeze play through the leaves of the new roses. I thought about the life I'd had with Maribel, the dinners, the laughter, the way she'd once looked at me like I was her whole world. I thought about the man she'd chosen to replace me with, the man who tried to break me. And I thought about how, in the end, he'd failed. Because here I was, in my own garden, with the promise of new blooms and a new beginning. I took a deep breath, the scent of fresh soil and steel filling my lungs. I wasn't the same man who'd watched helplessly as everything I'd built was torn apart. I was stronger, smarter. And though the past still lingered like an old bruise, it didn't own me anymore. I'd rebuilt my garden. I'd rebuilt my life. And as the first stars began to prick the night sky, I realized that maybe, just maybe, I'd rebuilt myself too. One morning, Maribel passed by. Alone. I was in the yard, kneeling at the base of the new rose arbor, the steel glinting in the sun like a promise. My hands were covered in soil as I guided a new vine along its supports, careful not to force it, letting it find its own path. That's when I felt her eyes on me, that familiar weight that used to feel like comfort and now felt like a shadow from a life that no longer fit. I didn't look up right away, letting the silence stretch between us. She stood at the sidewalk, her arms crossed, like she was holding herself together. A breeze lifted her hair, and for a second, I saw the girl I'd fallen in love with all those years ago. But then the wind died, and there she was again, older, thinner, the lines of worry etched deeper than before. "Jeremiah," she said finally, her voice quiet, as though she was testing how it would sound to call my name after all this time. I finished tying the vine, brushed the dirt from my hands, and stood. I met her gaze with the steady calm I'd worked so hard to build. Maribel. The name felt strange in my mouth now, like a word from a language I'd stopped speaking. She looked at the ground, her eyes tracing the cracks in the pavement, and then lifted her head to meet my eyes. There was no makeup, no jewelry, no mask. Just her. "The roses," she said, her voice catching. "They look beautiful." I nodded, the corners of my mouth twitching. "Thanks," I said. "Took some work." "Worth it, though." I let the silence settle, not offering her an easy out. If she wanted this conversation, she'd have to find the words. She took a deep breath, her shoulders trembling. "I never meant for things to get so," she trailed off, as if the right word was too heavy to lift. I didn't fill the gap. Instead, I watched her struggle, letting the weight of it rest where it belonged. She looked at the roses, at the strong steel that held them, and I saw something in her eyes, a flicker of regret, maybe, or understanding. "I thought I was choosing strength," she said. "Someone who would protect me, who wouldn't let me down." Her voice cracked. "But I chose wrong." She was crying now, tears slipping down her cheeks like rain on old glass. I remembered the nights I'd stayed awake beside her, listening to her breathing, thinking I'd do anything to keep her safe. How small that felt now. I sighed. the sound carrying the weight of every apology she'd never given. "You don't owe me anything," I said quietly. "Not anymore." She shook her head, desperate. "But I do. I owe you everything, Jeremiah. You were always—" Her voice broke, and she covered her mouth, as if she could stop the words from escaping. I looked at her and felt the ache of old wounds, the way they never quite healed right. "I was always the man you thought was too soft," I said, my voice steady, "until he turned out to be the one who was too hard." She flinched like I'd hit her, but I didn't apologize. I owed myself the truth. She reached out a trembling hand, as if to touch the arbor between us, but stopped short. "I wanted to come back," she whispered. "I wanted to say I'm sorry. For everything." I stared at her hand, the same one that had worn my ring once. "And?" I asked. Her fingers curled into a fist, and she pulled her hand back. "And I understand if you can't forgive me," she said. "But I needed to say it. I needed you to know." I looked at her, really looked. The woman I'd built a life with, who'd laughed at my jokes and cried in my arms. The woman who'd walked away without looking back. The woman who'd chosen him. And I felt the strangest thing, a deep, abiding peace. Because I didn't need her forgiveness, and she didn't need mine. We were done. She could carry her guilt, and I would carry my freedom. I nodded slowly. "I hear you," I said, "and I appreciate that you came here. But I've moved on, Maribel. I've got my garden, my work, my life. I don't need anything from you anymore." Her lips trembled, and she blinked rapidly, trying to hold back more tears. She nodded, too, and wiped her face with the back of her hand. "Okay," she whispered. "Okay." She turned to leave, but she paused at the edge of my yard, looking at the roses swaying gently in the breeze. "They really are beautiful," she said. "Just like you always wanted." I let the smallest smile touch my lips. "Yeah," I said. "They are." She nodded again, then turned and walked away, her footsteps light but unsteady. I watched her go, feeling the last thread between us unravel. It didn't hurt the way I'd expected. It felt like taking a deep breath after holding it too long. The sun was climbing higher now, the light catching the steel of the arbor and making it shine. I bent down and picked up my gardening gloves, feeling the dirt under my nails. This was my ground, my life, and no one was going to take that from me again. I went back to work, tending the new blooms. Each rose was a testament to resilience, its thorns sharp but its petals open to the sun. I thought of the days I'd spent on my knees in this soil, wondering if I'd ever feel whole again. I thought of the nights I'd spent staring at the ceiling, trying to understand how everything had fallen apart. And I thought of the way the roses reached for the sky, defiant and beautiful. Eloise arrived a little while later, her hair pulled back in a messy ponytail, a grin on her face that made my chest feel warm. "How's the patient?" she asked, nodding at the arbor. I smiled. "Sturdy as ever," I said. "Thanks to you." She came over and inspected the roses, her fingers brushing the leaves like she was greeting old friends. "You did good, Jeremiah," she said, her voice soft. "Really good." I looked at her, the way her eyes crinkled at the corners when she smiled, the smudge of soil on her cheek that she hadn't noticed. And I realized that the life I'd thought was over had just started again, different and stronger. "Couldn't have done it without you," I said, and meant it. She laughed, a sound like wind chimes. "Well, I think you would have found a way," she said. "But I'm glad I was here to see it." We spent the morning working side by side, her laughter mixing with the sound of bees and the rustle of leaves. The sun climbed higher, painting everything in gold. At one point, I stopped and looked at the arbor, the roses, the steel, and the blooms all intertwined. I thought of how it used to be, fragile, easy to break, and how now it stood unshakable, a symbol of everything I'd survived. Eloise caught me staring and nudged me gently. "Thinking about the past?" she asked. I shook my head, a small smile on my lips. "No," I said. "Thinking about how it's all worth it. Every scratch, every scar. It brought me here." She leaned her head on my shoulder for a moment, and I felt the comfort of her presence, solid and real. "Yeah," she said softly. "That's how the best gardens grow." Later, as the day wound down, she packed up her tools and headed to her truck. She turned before getting in, her eyes warm. "You know where to find me if you ever need help again," she said. I nodded. "Yeah," I said. "I know." She drove off, leaving a trail of dust that settled slowly in the quiet street. I stood there for a moment, the wind rustling the leaves, the sun dipping low. The roses swayed, their petals catching the last light of the day. I felt something shift inside me, a letting go of the man who'd been betrayed, the man who'd needed to prove himself. I was no longer the man defined by someone else's choices. I was my own man, standing in the garden I'd built, under an arbor I'd forged from steel and sweat and stubborn hope. The last light faded, leaving the garden bathed in the soft glow of twilight. I took a deep breath, the scent of roses and earth filling my lungs. For the first time in a long time, I didn't feel the ache of loss. I felt the fullness of what I'd reclaimed. The roses were stronger than before, their thorns sharper, their blooms more vibrant. And me? I was stronger, too. As I turned to go inside, I looked back one last time at the garden, at the steel arbor standing tall against the sky, at the roses that would keep growing, no matter what. And I smiled, not because I'd won, but because I'd survived, and because I knew that sometimes the final bloom isn't the end. It's the beginning. We started with the motion sensors. Omar showed me how to wire them to a battery pack, small enough to fit inside the base of a flower pot. We buried them under a thin layer of mulch, disguising them so perfectly that even I had to look twice to spot them. Every step felt like reclaiming a piece of what had been stolen from me. When the sensors were set, we moved on to the wildlife camera. It was small, no bigger than my palm, but powerful, with night vision and a timestamp feature. We positioned it on the fence facing the driveway, angled just right to catch anyone crossing the boundary. Omar tested it with a grin, waving his arms dramatically. "Smile, you son of a," he muttered, and I laughed, a sound I hadn't let myself feel in weeks. It felt good, like a spark of the old me. We wired the camera to a backup battery, so even if Troy tried to cut the power, it would keep recording. I checked the screen. Crystal clear. Even in the moonlight, I could see every detail. The lines on Omar's face, the scratches on the fence, the ghost of my broken rose arbor in the background. It was perfect. Last came the trip snare, a harmless but loud contraption that would trigger a blinding flash and a siren if tripped. "Won't hurt him," Omar said, his voice low, "but it'll scare the piss out of him." We set it near the walkway, hidden beneath a thick layer of mulch and a small wooden plank. He gave it a gentle nudge with his foot, and the rig clicked softly. "All set," he said. I felt a surge of relief, like I finally had a fighting chance. The two of us stood there in the dark, the smell of fresh earth in the air, listening to the faint sounds of night, an owl in the distance, the hum of insects. My heart felt lighter than it had in weeks. "Thanks, Omar," I said. He shook his head. "Don't thank me yet. Let's see what this guy's got." We shared a quiet moment of understanding. Two men who'd seen enough of the world to know that sometimes you had to fight your battles on your own terms. When he left, I stood alone in my yard, looking at the trap we built. I could almost see Troy's face, smug and confident, about to get the shock of his life. I whispered to myself, "Your move." I went inside, poured myself a glass of water, and sat by the window, watching the street. The house was silent except for the ticking of the old clock on the wall. I thought about all the times Maribel and I had sat on this porch, her laughter bright as the roses bloomed. I wondered if she'd ever think about the mess she'd left behind, the wreckage of what we'd built together. I felt a pang in my chest, but I let it go. This wasn't about her anymore. This was about me, about taking back what was mine. I stared at the garden, at the broken arbor. Tomorrow, I'd start rebuilding it. Stronger this time. Steel reinforcements, deeper roots. I'd make sure it was something no one could rip apart again. I was done letting other people decide what I deserved. As the clock struck midnight, I leaned back in my chair, the hum of the wildlife camera a comforting presence. I pictured Troy stumbling through my yard, all his arrogance stripped away by the cold reality of a trap he never saw coming. I pictured his face, confused, angry, humiliated. And for the first time in a long time, I smiled. Not out of malice, but out of relief. Because I wasn't powerless anymore. I was ready. And tomorrow night, when he came for me again, I'd be waiting. At exactly 2:16 a.m., the alarm screamed. I jolted awake, my heart pounding so fast it felt like it might burst from my chest. The house seemed to shake with the sudden blare, the shriek of the siren echoing off the walls like a living thing. For a split second, I froze, my mind foggy with sleep and adrenaline. But then instinct took over. I leapt from the bed, feet bare on the cool floor, and rushed to the window. My breath caught when I saw the chaos unfolding in my yard. There he was, Troy Maddox, caught red-handed. His figure was illuminated by the security floodlight that had flipped on automatically, casting every detail into sharp relief. His arms flailed as he tried to shield his eyes from the blinding flash of the triggered snare. Paint, thick, electric blue, covered his shirt, his arms, his face. He looked like a clown, and a dangerous one at that. The wildlife camera mounted on the fence captured every second, its red light blinking steadily like an unblinking eye. My chest heaved with a mix of rage and triumph. Troy stumbled, trying to regain his balance, but he tripped over the sensor wire Omar and I had hidden beneath the mulch. He hit the ground hard, his hands splaying in the dirt, the hammer he'd been carrying clattering out of reach. I could see nails spilling from his pocket, the small silver projectiles that had become his weapon of choice against my tires. For a moment, he just sat there, stunned, covered in paint like a criminal mime caught in the act. The siren wailed on, a piercing scream that seemed to slice the night in half. I didn't move. I didn't rush outside or yell. I just stood there by the window, staring at him. I wanted to savor this moment, to let it burn into my memory like a brand. The look on his face, shock, confusion, a flicker of fear, was worth every late night I'd spent planning this. I'd always been the quiet one, the one who followed the rules, who didn't make a fuss. But not tonight. Tonight, I'd turned the tables. He'd thought he could break me, humiliate me in front of the whole neighborhood. But now he was the one on the ground, the one with nowhere to hide. He staggered to his feet, wiping at the paint that dripped down his face in slow, mocking rivulets. His eyes darted around wildly, as if he thought someone might come to his rescue. But the street was empty, silent except for the dying echoes of the alarm and the faint, taunting beep of the wildlife camera. He looked straight at my window, his eyes narrowing when he saw me standing there. I didn't flinch. I didn't wave or shout. I just stared him down, my arms folded, my expression cold. This was my territory, and he was the invader. He opened his mouth, maybe to curse or threaten, but no sound came out. Instead, he turned and fled, leaving behind a trail of blue footprints that marked his shame across my lawn and down the sidewalk. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. The tension drained from my shoulders in a slow, satisfying wave. I felt like I'd just run a marathon, every nerve in my body on fire. But beneath the exhaustion was a fierce, steady satisfaction. I'd done it. I'd exposed him. I walked to the front door and stepped outside, the cool night air washing over me like a cleansing balm. The garden was a mess, footprints in the mulch, paint on the walkway, broken stems where he'd stumbled. But it didn't feel like defeat anymore. It felt like proof. Proof that I wasn't crazy. Proof that he'd been targeting me all along. Proof that he'd underestimated me. I knelt down and picked up the hammer he'd dropped. It was cheap, the kind you'd find at a discount store, but it felt heavy in my hand. I turned it over, inspecting the worn handle and the faint blue smears on the metal. Evidence. I'd bag it up and keep it safe. I'd show it to the police if they asked. I stood there for a long time, breathing in the quiet. The wildlife camera's red light blinked steadily, a silent witness to everything that had happened. I imagined the footage, Troy creeping into my yard, the tripwire springing, the paint exploding over him like a trap from some slapstick movie. I pictured the moment he realized he'd been caught, the panic that must have flared in his eyes. I smiled, not because I wanted revenge, but because I'd refused to let him win. Eventually, I turned off the siren, letting the night settle back into its usual stillness. I went back inside, my bare feet tracking a little dirt across the floor. In the kitchen, I poured myself a glass of water, my hands steady now. The adrenaline was fading, leaving behind a cold determination. This wasn't over, but the balance had shifted. I wasn't the prey anymore. I was the one setting the traps. I was the one holding the evidence. And tomorrow, I'd decide what to do with it. As I sat at the table, staring at the wildlife camera's memory card in my hand, I thought about Maribel. I wondered what she'd say when she saw the footage, her big, strong man caught in the act, humiliated and painted like a fool. Would she defend him? Would she finally see what I'd been trying to tell her all along? I didn't know. And maybe it didn't matter, because I wasn't doing this for her anymore. I was doing it for me, for the quiet dignity I'd spent a lifetime building, for the house I'd worked for the garden I'd tended with my own two hands. I stood and walked to the window one last time. The yard was still, the paint already drying under the moonlight. I could almost feel my dad's presence beside me, his steady voice in my ear. "You did good, son," I imagined him saying. "You didn't let him beat you." I nodded, the words echoing in the quiet. I was tired, but it was a good kind of tired. The kind that came from fighting for something that mattered. I turned off the kitchen light and headed to bed, the memory card safe in my pocket. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, its own questions. But tonight, I'd earned this small victory. And for the first time in months, I slept soundly, knowing that when the sun rose, I'd face it on my terms. The next morning, I waited on my porch, a cup of coffee in hand, feeling the breeze tease the edges of my hair. It was a calm morning, deceptively peaceful, the kind that should have come with the smell of fresh-cut grass and the distant bark of a neighbor's dog. But today had a different kind of anticipation in the air, like the moment right before a storm breaks. I'd slept better than I had in weeks. The memory of Troy's face, painted like a fool and caught red-handed, still brought a quiet smile to my lips. But that wasn't the end of it. It was only the beginning. I saw them coming from down the street, Maribel's white SUV rolling in slow, deliberate. She was driving, sunglasses on, lips pressed together in that way that told me she was rehearsing what she'd say. Troy was in the passenger seat, his face still marked with faint smears of blue despite his attempts to scrub them clean. Even from a distance, I could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his jaw was set tight. He looked like a man trying to hold on to the last scraps of his pride. As they pulled into their driveway, I stood and waited, my hand gripping the small USB drive that held the footage from last night. Maribel stepped out first, smoothing her skirt like she was headed into church. She tried to look casual, but the glance she gave me was anything but. It was sharp, cautious, like she was bracing for a fight she wasn't sure she'd win. Troy stayed in the car a moment longer, then stepped out, his eyes hidden behind those mirrored sunglasses. He didn't look at me. Couldn't, I guessed. His smirk was gone. That was enough for now. I crossed the street slowly, my boots crunching on the pavement. I felt every step, felt the shift in the air as I closed the distance. Maribel turned toward me, arms folded, trying to look unbothered. "What do you want, Jeremiah?" she asked, her voice flat. I held up the USB drive, letting it catch the morning light. "I think you dropped something," I said evenly, the words tasting like a quiet victory. She frowned. "What is that?" I didn't answer right away. I turned it over in my hand, watching the reflection of the sky on its surface. "It's proof," I said finally. "Proof that your husband isn't just a bully. He's a criminal." Her mouth opened in protest, but I cut her off. "Before you say anything, watch it. All of it. And then you can come talk to me about what a real man looks like." I held it out to her. She hesitated, her eyes darting to Troy, who had started to fidget like a cornered animal. Finally, she took it. Her hand trembled as she held it between her fingers, like it was something dangerous. "What did you do, Jeremiah?" she demanded, her voice shaky now. "I didn't do anything," I said, my tone calm and steady. "I just documented the truth. It's all on there. The paint, the hammer, the nails." The smirk on his face when he thought no one was watching. Her face paled. She turned to Troy, who shifted uncomfortably, his jaw working as if he wanted to spit something back at me but couldn't find the words. I didn't give him the chance. "Play it," I said, gesturing to their porch. "See for yourself." She stared at me for a moment, her expression caught between disbelief and something like guilt. Then she turned on her heel and stormed up the steps, nearly tripping in her haste to get to her laptop. I watched her plug the drive in, watched her hands shake as she moved the cursor. Troy stood at the bottom of the steps, glaring at me like he wanted to hit me but knew he couldn't. Not now. Not with the truth staring him in the face. I crossed my arms and waited. I didn't need to see the screen to know what she was watching. The night vision footage, Troy stumbling through my yard, the paint explosion, the hammer in his hand, the nails in his pocket. Every second of his humiliation laid bare. Maribel's gasp carried across the yard like a slap. "Troy," she whispered, her voice cracking. "What did you do?" He didn't answer. He just stood there, his shoulders hunched, his sunglasses suddenly too heavy for his face. She turned to me, tears brimming in her eyes. "Jeremiah, you didn't." I shook my head, a small, bitter smile on my lips. "I did," I said, "because no one else was going to protect what's mine. Not the police. Not you. Just me." Her shoulders sagged, the fight leaving her body. She turned back to the screen, the footage still playing. Troy's painted face frozen in a moment of pure, guilty panic. She reached up and covered her mouth, like she might be sick. "I didn't know," she whispered, the words barely there. I didn't want to believe. I let out a long breath, feeling a weight lift from my chest. "Now you know," I said, "and you can choose what you do with that. But I'm done letting him walk all over me. I'm done being the victim." Troy finally found his voice, his words low and broken. You set me up, he accused, his eyes full of rage and shame. I met his gaze without blinking. No, I said. You set yourself up. I just gave you the opportunity to prove who you really are. He looked away, his hands balling into fists at his sides. Maribel was still staring at the screen, tears streaking down her cheeks. I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. But then I remembered every scratch, every nail, every smug grin he'd given me, and the sympathy faded. She'd chosen him. Now she had to live with that choice. I turned to leave, my boots crunching on the gravel. Jeremiah, she called after me, her voice pleading. I paused but didn't turn back. What happens now? She asked. I took a deep breath, feeling the early morning sun on my face. That's up to you, I said. But I've done my part. I'm done being afraid. I kept walking, not looking back as I crossed the street. The weight of the past few months felt lighter on my shoulders. I'd stood my ground. I'd shown him for who he was. And whatever came next, I'd be ready for it. I didn't have to press charges. The beauty of the footage was that it spoke louder than any lawyer or police report could. After forwarding the video to Officer Delgado, a local friend who'd seen enough neighborhood drama to fill a whole career, I didn't have to wait long. Within 24 hours, there was a knock on Troy's door. I was in my front yard, tending to the few surviving flowers left in the wrecked garden, when I heard it, the authoritative rap of Delgado's knuckles against the wood. I didn't even have to look up to know who it was for. I watched from a safe distance, hands deep in the dirt as if that small act of normalcy could shield me from the electric satisfaction thrumming in my veins. Delgado was dressed in his uniform, his badge glinting in the sunlight, every inch the calm but firm figure I'd come to rely on. Troy opened the door, trying to act like he didn't have pain under his fingernails and guilt written across his face. Delgado's voice carried across the yard, firm and even, like he'd rehearsed this 100 times. Mr. Maddox, I need to speak with you about a complaint of vandalism and trespassing, he said. Troy's jaw worked like he was chewing glass. What are you talking about? He snapped. Delgado didn't flinch. He gestured with a small evidence bag, the hammer I'd handed him earlier, still marked with blue smears. We have evidence, Mr. Maddox. A video that shows you on your neighbor's property with the intent to damage it. And there's also the matter of the paint, the nails. Troy's face turned red. This is bullshit, he shouted. But even from where I stood, I could see the panic in his eyes. Delgado remained calm. Sir, I'm not here to debate. I'm here to let you know you're being served with a restraining order and an official warning. You're not to come within 50 feet of Mr. Knox's property. If you do, we'll press charges. And trust me, we've got enough to make that stick. I felt a smile tug at the corner of my mouth. Not a vengeful smile, but a relieved one. Finally, someone saw what I'd been dealing with. Finally, there were consequences. Troy blustered, his words coming out in a tangled mess of denial and rage. He set me up. He's always been jealous, but Delgado cut him off, his voice a quiet but unyielding wall. Sir, the footage speaks for itself. I've seen it. So has my captain. This isn't about jealousy or grudges. It's about the law. You broke it. Now you face the consequences. Maribel stood in the doorway, pale and silent. She looked at Troy like she didn't even recognize him. Part of me ached at that, at what she'd chosen, at what she'd lost. But another part felt a grim satisfaction. She'd picked him over me, and now she could see who he really was. I didn't feel sorry for him. Not anymore. Delgado handed him a small envelope, the restraining order. Troy snatched it, crumpling it in his fist like that could erase its contents. Delgado turned and met my eyes across the yard. He gave me a small, satisfied nod, a silent promise that justice had been done, at least in part. I nodded back, my hands still caked in dirt, but my heart feeling cleaner than it had in months. As Delgado walked back to his cruiser, Troy glared at me, his face a twisted mask of hate and fear. He couldn't come near me now. He couldn't touch my property, my car, my life. The power he'd held over me had vanished with that restraining order, like a spell broken. I didn't gloat. I didn't jeer. I just stood there, steady and silent, the wind brushing against my face like a promise that the worst of the storm had passed. Delgado paused by my mailbox, his hand resting on the top. Jeremiah, he called. I walked over, brushing the dirt from my hands, the smell of soil grounding me. Yeah, I said, my voice calm. He looked at me with that mixture of authority and friendship I'd come to trust. You did the right thing, he said. You stayed smart. You documented everything. Most guys would have swung first and asked questions later. I nodded, my throat tight. Thanks, I managed. He smiled faintly. Stay safe, okay? If he tries anything else, you call me. No hesitation. I held his gaze. I will, I promised.